here is the test that I always like to do to make sure that your angle is correct, okay? And this is the one I was trying to explain to you. I don't know if I did a good enough job. If you take your strands, you saw how I did that, right? I'm doing 6 strands, I laid 3 strands overlapping before I put it on, okay? The reason that you do that is that your strands are going to wrap around the handle. Ultimately, what they're really doing is just wrapping around, just in an alternating pattern. So what you can do is if you take your 3 strands from the one side, you should be able to wrap them around so that when they come back around the other side, the top of the top strand is coming to the bottom of the bottom strand. There should be no gaps. See what I mean? And that's how you can tell if your angles are okay. That means that as you're braiding, the bottom strand, the next strand is going to be perfectly aligned with that one. The next strand is going to be perfectly aligned. So, to get this pattern, is this what a lot of people are familiar with in terms of a pattern, right? I mean, you can really do anything. And these, right? This is actually an 8 strand. Yeah, it's a chevron, but it's an 8 strand. 3 pink and 1 black. And somebody got schmutz on it. I'm going to blame Kenny because I got nobody else to
Probably
So, this is what's referred to as a 6 strand, over 1, under 1, over 1 braid. That works with anything. If I did 10 strands, 8 strands, the thing to keep in mind, this is where it starts to get a little bit geeky, so I apologize. I'm going to get in here. If you unroll your leather, you'll see I've got 3 strands of leather going one way, 3 strands going the other, okay? Now what I'm going to do to start is right at the top, you'll see there's sort of like this intersection, right where the 3 strands overlap, okay? And that's basically where I'm going to start my braid real quick, simply because it's convenient to do. So what I'm doing is I'm just going over 1, under 1, over 1, which just basically means every time you get to a strand, it alternates. So when I start, this is exactly where I want to be. So I've started with the alternating pattern. Now this is where it gets a little bit geeky. So you'll see I have a strand that's just gone over. Remember I said over, under, over. If I did 8 strands, it would be under, over, under, over. You always want to end with an over because that's what's holding down the rest of your braid. So I've got 3 strands here, 3 strands here, right? So what I'm going to be doing is this is what's called the standing part, which basically means, and I'm not exaggerating, it's standing around doing a whole lot of nothing. It's not the active piece. Then you have what's referred to as the working part, which is the strand that you are working. So I have just come over this way. That is now the standing part. It's not doing anything. I'm holding it. The back of the other side is now your working part. So you can see I've got 3 strands, 3 strands. This is my standing side. This is my working side. And it changes every time. I take my back strand, and you'll see I go over, under, over. Lay it in, and then what you always want to do is make sure that you are getting sufficient tension. And then all you got to do is just check to make sure that your strands are lined up. Right? So now, on the other side, this is now my standing part. I take my back strand on the other side and go over, under, over. And that's it. If you do anything longer than this, and I didn't bring it with me and I recommend it, again, not really a fancy tool, but I've got a tabletop vise. Just one of those ones that clamps to a table. Why that is important is if you've got everything in a vise, you'll find if you braid anything even remotely complex, you start to do this, and your braid, like you'll see how these are all lined up, right? Well, if you're not careful, your strands, if you see them on badly made whips, if you follow the seam, they'll start to torque around, right? And the more it torques, to me, the less attention they're paying, the less care went into it. Really, really well-made whips, you can pretty much set a ruler on. They are dead straight. And a vise lets you do that. You basically can set your seam that you're working, and as you're moving it up, the seam stays in the same place. And your whip handle, whatever you're braiding, doesn't move around. These are short enough. The strands are wide enough. I've never had a problem with them, but a vise is a handy tool. If you're going to get into any braiding at all, I recommend a vise. Definitely. So,
$12 at those.
Yeah, I mean, they're not, the tabletop ones, it doesn't need to be like I'm holding I-beams in it. I mean, it's just enough that you want to be able to put tension and have everything be held in place. So, now, I could sit here and do this for a day and a half, but I don't really want to bore people to death. Yeah, exactly. So, what you have to keep in mind is it is the pattern. This pattern will work, like I said, for 10 strands, 8 strands, 16 strands. All you're doing is just sort of complicating it by the number of strands, but it kind of freaks people out sometimes, like, oh, 16, I've only ever done 4. It's the same thing. As long as you know the pattern, and as long as you're ending on an over, and you're alternating, you can get into all kinds of more complex patterns, but if you're simply doing a checkerboard pattern, just make sure that you're ending on an over, and if you're not, something's just happened with your pattern. Go back one strand and kind of figure it out, and you'll be good. So all I do, and you'll see because this is the front part, the back is not obviously braided down as far, it doesn't braid evenly, it's always going to be the width of the strands. You braid this down, just pull the back ends over, hold it, tie it off, and then what I do, again, is just to make sure my tension is good. Before I tape it, I pull on all my strands again to make sure my tension is good. Check to make sure that you're, here, want to take a look at that? See? No, I'm just saying, at 45, all the seams are moving. I'm serious, I'm not being sarcastic.
It's not ish.
Okay. What's that?
Is that ish?
Ish. I don't know. Could be ish, right? But that's my point. So you get the ends tied off, and then you've got a braided hand. So now what you want to do, in theory, what?
What?
No, you shake your head. I'm just.
No, that bastard doesn't work for me. It's what it said in my head.
That's not the first time I've been called that.
It won't be the last either.
Oh. It won't be the last today.
But now, did you read that part where I said that maybe because my dowels are like, I had an inch dowel, an inch and a quarter, and then had leather over that. So,
Yeah.
do you think that was effective?
Yeah, what you got to do, you have to get the size of the measurement of what you're actually braiding. So when I do my measurements, I don't use a standard, like in theory, and this is one of the things that's really important if you're going to get into this in any kind of involved way. The dowels are always going to be a consistent size, period. They're going to be 3/4 of an inch. They're like micrometers and whatever when they're coming out. They're going to be the same size. But even if you're using the same leather, even if you're using the same hide of leather, it's not always going to be as thick in one place as in another. So once I put my bolster on that I showed you, I always measure it after that. That's the piece that I'm...
But you would still use the same 45-degree angle? You wouldn't have to change that?
No, because the strands in theory, and I'll get to that, the strands in theory should be cut to the measurement of your handle, right? So if you're using a bigger handle, your strands would be wider. So the angle is still going to work. Okay?